The day of broken promises. The sun was radiant that morning, casting a golden glow over the quaint town of Oakville. It was a day that promised happiness, a celebration of love, and the beginning of a new chapter for Julia Reynolds. The church bells echoed in the air, and the scent of freshly cut roses filled the atmosphere as guests arrived for what was meant to be the happiest day of Julia's life, her wedding day. Inside the church, Julia stood before a tall, ornate mirror, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted her lace-trimmed veil. Her reflection revealed a stunning woman, her long brown hair cascading down her back, and her ivory dress hugging her form perfectly. But beneath the beauty, there was a hint of nervousness. Her heart pounded as if it was trying to escape from her chest. "Breathe, Julia," her maid of honor, Katie, said softly, sensing her unease. "Today is your day. You and Matthew are going to have a perfect life together." Julia nodded, offering a weak smile. But something felt off. She couldn't quite place it, but a small seed of doubt had planted itself in her mind in the past few weeks. Matthew had seemed distant lately, preoccupied, cold even. She brushed the thought away, convincing herself that wedding jitters were normal. After all, they had been planning this day for over a year, and Matthew had always been the one who reassured her when she felt overwhelmed. Meanwhile, outside, Matthew Stinson was pacing nervously, his groomsmen doing their best to calm him down. His dark hair was slicked back, and his black tuxedo was sharp, but his face was pale, and his hands fidgeted constantly with his tie. He hadn't been sleeping well for days. His mind was clouded with thoughts, doubts, and guilt. Matthew loved Julia, or at least he thought he did. But the closer the wedding day came, the more he questioned everything. "Relax, man. It's just nerves," his best man, Derek, said, clapping him on the back. "Everyone gets cold feet. You've been with Julia for years. You guys are perfect for each other." Matthew forced a smile, but inside he was in turmoil. Perfect. He had spent the past few months wondering if he was making the right choice. His career was taking off. He had met new people, experienced new things, and he started to feel suffocated by the idea of forever. The idea of Julia, sweet and loving as she was, no longer felt like the exciting partner he had once envisioned. But was that reason enough to leave her standing at the altar? The clock ticked closer to the ceremony. The guests were all seated, the soft murmur of conversations filling the grand hall of the church. Julia's family sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Her mother dabbed tears from her eyes, overwhelmed by the joy of seeing her only daughter get married. Julia's father, a man of few words, wore a quiet smile, nodding approvingly as the church filled. Back in the dressing room, Julia took one final look at herself in the mirror. She was beautiful, yes, but she was also uncertain. The moments dragged on, and with each passing second, a cold feeling began to wash over her. She glanced at Katie. "What if he doesn't show?" she whispered, her voice shaky. Katie's eyes widened. "What? Don't be ridiculous. Of course he'll show. Matthew loves you. He's probably just nervous." But Julia wasn't so sure. The weeks leading up to the wedding had been filled with moments where Matthew was distant, distracted. He canceled dinners, avoided conversations about the future, and had seemed more interested in his work than in their upcoming marriage. Now, standing here, dressed in white, Julia felt the doubt tightening its grip around her heart. The organ music began to play softly, signaling the start of the ceremony. Julia's heart raced. The bridesmaids lined up, the flower girl twirled her basket of petals, and the groomsmen took their places at the front. Matthew stood by the altar, staring blankly ahead. The double doors at the back of the church opened, and all eyes turned to Julia as she began her walk down the aisle. The room was silent except for the soft rustle of her dress as it skimmed the floor. Her gaze was fixed on Matthew, her heart pounding. But as she walked closer, something shifted in his expression. There was no joy in his eyes, no anticipation, just emptiness. Halfway down the aisle, Julia's steps faltered. She could feel it, Something was terribly wrong. Matthew's face had gone pale, his hands were trembling, and suddenly, before anyone could react, he stepped back from the altar. He whispered something to Derek, who looked at him in shock, but Matthew didn't stop. He turned, and without another word, he walked out of the church. Gasps filled the air as the guests watched in disbelief. Julia froze, her heart shattering into a million pieces. The man she loved, the man she was about to marry, had just left her in front of everyone she knew and loved. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not now. She turned to her parents, who were already on their feet, rushing toward her, but the damage was done. Her perfect day had been destroyed in the most humiliating way possible. Julia's world collapsed around her as she stood in the center of the church, abandoned and broken. As the days passed, Julia's heartbreak turned into anger. She disappeared from the public eye, cutting herself off from everyone except for a few close friends and her family. The whispers around town grew louder. How could Matthew have left her like that? What kind of man walks away from a woman at the altar? But for Julia, the pain ran deeper than the gossip. She had been betrayed by the one person she had trusted the most, and that betrayal would leave a scar that would take years to heal. Matthew, on the other hand, had vanished. He left town, unable to face the consequences of his actions. He had broken Julia's heart, but he had also destroyed a part of himself in the process. For years, he lived with regret, haunted by the decision to walk away from the woman who had loved him unconditionally. But fate has a strange way of catching up with those who try to outrun it. And years later, when Matthew's own life fell apart, he would find himself standing in front of a judge, fighting for a divorce from his second wife, a woman he never truly loved. And as he looked up, his heart stopped. The judge was Julia, the girl he had left behind. The judge's gavel. Years had passed since the day Matthew walked out of that church, leaving Julia behind with nothing but shattered dreams and public humiliation. Time had a way of reshaping wounds, but scars remained, etched into Julia's heart. She had moved forward, or so it seemed on the surface, but the betrayal still lingered like a shadow that she could never fully escape. After that fateful day, Julia threw herself into her work. She had always been a brilliant student, determined and focused. Law had been her passion long before Matthew had entered her life, and now, in the wake of her heartbreak, it became her refuge. She enrolled in law school, fueled by a new sense of purpose, one that wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations. Julia's journey to becoming a judge was filled with grueling years of hard work, late-night study sessions, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Her pain had transformed her into someone unrecognizable from the innocent bride she had once been. A stronger, more self-assured woman who no longer needed anyone's approval. By the time she reached the bench, Julia had developed a reputation for being tough but fair. She didn't let emotions cloud her judgment. Each case was treated with precision and care, and she had an unwavering commitment to seeing justice served. Her sharp mind and unyielding sense of ethics earned her the respect of her colleagues and the community. People admired her resilience, though few truly knew the story behind her drive. She had spent years burying the pain of Matthew's betrayal, refusing to let it define her. While some friends and family occasionally brought up his name, Julia never did. To her, Matthew was a ghost, an unpleasant reminder of her past that she had long since exorcised. Or so she thought. One rainy afternoon, Julia sat in her chambers, reviewing files for the upcoming week. Her desk was neatly organized, each case laid out with meticulous care. She flipped through the pages of a divorce case scheduled for the following morning, a routine matter involving a couple whose marriage had disintegrated under the weight of financial stress and infidelity. Divorce cases were never pleasant, but Julia handled them with the same professionalism she applied to everything in her life. As she skimmed through the paperwork, her eyes landed on the names of the parties involved: Matthew Stinson and Alyssa Stinson. For a moment, Julia froze. The name struck her like a bolt of lightning, sending a chill down her spine. Her heart began to race, and she felt a knot form in her stomach. Could it be the same Matthew Stinson, the man who had left her at the altar all those years ago? Her mind flashed back to that fateful day. The shame, the disbelief, the way her heart had shattered as she stood there, watching him walk away. She had spent so long burying those memories, trying to forget the pain. But here it was, staring her in the face, demanding to be acknowledged. Julia took a deep breath, steadying herself. There was no room for emotion in her courtroom. Whatever personal history she had with Matthew, it couldn't interfere with her duty as a judge. She had to remain impartial, no matter how much her heart screamed otherwise. The next morning, Julia arrived at the courthouse early, as she always did. She sat behind her desk, her face calm and composed, though inside, a storm was brewing. She knew today wouldn't be like any other day. She would face the man who had abandoned her without a second thought, but this time she would hold the power. The thought gave her a strange sense of satisfaction, a quiet victory she hadn't anticipated. The courtroom buzzed with the usual activity, lawyers preparing their arguments, clients whispering nervously to their attorneys, and court staff shuffling papers. Julia sat in her chair at the front, her gavel resting on the desk in front of her, waiting for the session to begin. She glanced at the clock. Any minute now, Matthew would walk through those doors. And then he did. Julia's heart skipped a beat as Matthew entered the courtroom, flanked by his attorney. He looked different, older, worn down by time and life. His once boyish charm had faded, replaced by a tired expression and deep lines etched into his face. He was still handsome in a way, but there was a heaviness about him that hadn't been there before. As their eyes met, Julia saw the flicker of recognition in Matthew's gaze. His steps faltered slightly, and for a brief moment, he looked as though he had seen a ghost. In a way, he had. The girl he had left behind was gone, replaced by a woman of strength and authority, a woman who now held his future in her hands. Matthew quickly composed himself, but Julia could see the unease in his eyes. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her. The proceedings began, and Julia's voice was steady as she called the case. Matthew Stinson and Alyssa Stinson, she said, her tone even, betraying none of the emotions swirling inside her. We are here to settle the matter of your divorce. As the lawyers began to present their arguments, Julia watched Matthew closely. He avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the table in front of him. It was clear that his life hadn't turned out the way he had imagined. According to the case file, his second marriage had been a disaster, filled with arguments, infidelity, and financial strain. Alyssa, his soon-to-be ex-wife, was seeking a large portion of his assets, claiming that she had supported him throughout their marriage while he pursued various failed business ventures. It was a mess, and Matthew looked like a man who had lost everything. But what struck Julia the most was how small he seemed. The confident, charming man she had once loved was gone, replaced by someone who appeared defeated by life. A part of her felt vindicated. After all, he had abandoned her in the cruelest way possible. But another part of her, the part that had once loved him deeply, felt a twinge of sadness. As the lawyers debated back and forth, Julia remained composed, her expression unreadable. She listened carefully to both sides, asking questions when necessary, but never revealing the storm that raged inside her. When it was Matthew's turn to speak, he stood up, his eyes briefly meeting hers before quickly darting away. He stammered through his statement, trying to defend himself against Alyssa's claims, but his voice lacked conviction. He was a shell of the man he used to be, and it was painfully obvious. When the session ended for the day, Julia adjourned the court, her gavel coming down with a firm thud. "We will reconvene tomorrow," she said, her tone final. The room began to empty, and Julia gathered her papers, preparing to leave. But before she could stand, Matthew approached the bench. "Julia," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "can we talk?" Julia looked up at him, her eyes cold and distant. The years had changed her, but in this moment, she felt like the young woman who had been left at the altar all over again. She had so much she could say to him, so much anger, so much hurt, but she knew now wasn't the time. "I'm not the one you need to speak to," she said firmly. "You're here for your divorce, not to relive the past." Matthew opened his mouth to speak, but Julia cut him off. "Court is adjourned, Mr. Stinson. You'll have your chance to say whatever you need to tomorrow." With that, she stood and walked out of the courtroom, leaving Matthew standing there, just as he had once left her standing at the altar. But this time, the roles had reversed. Julia was the one walking away, and Matthew was the one left behind, facing the ghosts of the past. The following morning dawned gray and overcast, matching the heaviness that lingered in Julia's heart. She had barely slept the night before, her mind swirling with memories of Matthew and the life they had once planned together. No matter how much time had passed, no matter how successful or composed she had become, the wound he left in her heart had never fully healed. But today, she reminded herself, was not about the past. It was about upholding the law, about fairness, and most of all, about keeping her dignity intact. She was a judge now, respected, formidable, and impartial. Personal feelings had no place in the courtroom, even if the person sitting before her had once destroyed her world. As Julia sat at her desk that morning, flipping through the notes from the previous day, she found herself replaying the look on Matthew's face when he had realized who she was. There had been shock, of course, but also something else. Regret. A deep, palpable regret that seemed to weigh him down like a burden too heavy to carry. It had been years since that awful day at the altar, but the pain still showed in his eyes. Shaking her head, Julia forced herself to focus. She couldn't let these thoughts cloud her judgment. The courtroom wasn't a place for personal vendettas. Matthew was just another case, and she was determined to treat it that way. The courtroom began to fill once more. Lawyers took their places, documents were shuffled, and the quiet murmurs of anticipation rippled through the room. Julia's heart beat a little faster as she heard the familiar footsteps entering the chamber. Matthew's footsteps. She didn't look up right away, but she could feel his presence. It was strange how a person who once occupied so much space in your life could suddenly feel like a stranger, and yet so familiar. When she finally lifted her gaze, there he was, sitting at the defendant's table. He looked even more worn than the day before, as if the weight of their past had caught up to him overnight. His eyes were dark, hollow, and his once carefully styled hair was now streaked with gray. Life had been unkind to him, it seemed. Alyssa, his soon-to-be ex-wife, sat across from him, her face expressionless, but her posture tense. She was a striking woman, tall with dark hair and sharp features, the kind of person who commanded attention without trying. But there was bitterness in her eyes, something cold and unforgiving. Julia could tell that whatever love had once existed between Alyssa and Matthew had long since evaporated, replaced by the venom that often accompanies broken promises and unmet expectations. As the hearing resumed, Julia kept her focus on the facts. The divorce was contentious, as most divorces were. Alyssa accused Matthew of neglect, of spending recklessly on failed business ventures, of emotional abandonment. Matthew, in turn, claimed that Alyssa had been unsupportive, that her constant criticisms had driven him to his poor decisions. It was the same sad story she had seen time and time again in her courtroom. Two people who had once loved each other, now tearing each other apart with bitterness and regret. But as the proceedings dragged on, Julia couldn't help but notice how disconnected Matthew seemed. He answered questions when asked, but his mind was elsewhere. He barely looked at Alyssa, and when he did, there was no animosity, only exhaustion. It was as though he was too tired to fight anymore, too tired to care. By midday, the courtroom took a break for lunch. Julia rose from her seat, her gavel in hand, and declared the adjournment. As the room began to empty, Matthew lingered behind. Julia could feel his eyes on her as she gathered her papers, but she refused to look at him. Not today. Not again. "Julia," Matthew's voice came softly from across the room. She paused, her back still turned to him. She had hoped to avoid this, but it seemed inevitable. Slowly, she turned around, her expression neutral. "What is it, Mr. Stinson?" she asked, keeping her tone professional. "If this is about the case, I suggest you speak to your attorney." "It's not about the case," Matthew said, his voice heavy with emotion. He took a tentative step forward, but Julia remained rooted in place. "It's about us. I know I don't have the right to ask, but can we talk? Just for a minute. I owe you an explanation." Julia felt her chest tighten. She had spent years wondering why Matthew had left her at the altar, years trying to move on without ever receiving the closure she needed. And now, here he was, offering that very thing. But could she trust him? Could she handle hearing whatever excuse he had for breaking her heart? "I'm not sure there's anything you could say that would make a difference now," she replied coolly. "It's been a long time, Matthew. We've both moved on." "I haven't," Matthew said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never moved on, Julia. I thought about you every single day. What I did was unforgivable, and I've paid for it in more ways than you know." Something in his voice caught her off guard, a raw honesty she hadn't expected. She had imagined this moment so many times, picturing herself tearing into him, making him feel the same pain he had caused her. But now, standing here, she felt tired, exhausted by the weight of the past. "What happened, Matthew?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. "Why did you leave? You owed me at least that much." Matthew looked down at the floor, running a hand through his graying hair. For a long moment, he didn't speak, and Julia wondered if he would at all. But then, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers, filled with a mixture of regret and sadness. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I was scared of what marriage meant, of the responsibility, of the idea of forever. I wasn't ready, and instead of being honest with you, I ran. I thought I could escape it, but the truth is, I was just running from myself." Julia stood there, absorbing his words. A part of her wanted to scream at him, to tell him that his fear had destroyed her, that his cowardice had left a wound that had taken years to heal. But another part of her, one she hadn't acknowledged in a long time, felt a flicker of understanding. She had known Matthew better than anyone once, and she knew how he struggled with his own insecurities. But that didn't excuse what he had done. "You left me humiliated, Matthew," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "You didn't just break my heart. You shattered my life in front of everyone I knew. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" "I know," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "And I'll never forgive myself for it. I lost the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too selfish, too afraid to face the future, and I've regretted it every day since." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The courtroom was empty now, and the only sound was the distant hum of voices from the hallway outside. Julia's heart raced, torn between the anger she had carried for so long and the strange sense of closure that was beginning to take root. "I don't know what you want from me, Matthew," she said finally. "I'm not that girl anymore. I've built a life for myself, a life without you. And honestly, I'm happier than I ever thought I could be." Matthew nodded, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm glad," he said. "You deserve that, Julia. You deserve everything." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "I know you can't forgive me, and I don't expect you to. But I just needed you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." Julia looked at him, searching his face for any sign of deception, but all she saw was the truth. Matthew was broken in his own way, and though his apology couldn't undo the past, it was more than she had ever expected to receive. "I appreciate the apology," she said quietly, "but forgiveness, that's something I'll have to think about." Matthew nodded, accepting her response without protest. He turned to leave, but before he stepped through the door, he glanced back at her one last time. "Take care, Julia," he said softly. "You're an incredible woman." And with that, he was gone, leaving Julia alone in the empty courtroom. The past had finally caught up to both of them. But this time, Julia wasn't the one left behind. She was the one in control now, the one with the power to decide how this chapter of her life would end. As she sat back down at her desk, the weight of the moment settled over her. Closure didn't always come neatly tied with a bow. Sometimes it was messy and complicated. But for the first time in years, Julia felt like she could breathe again. Tomorrow, the case would continue, and she would be the judge, impartial, fair, and just. But today, she was simply Julia, the woman who had finally confronted the ghosts of her past. And in doing so, she had begun to reclaim her future. Shattered reflections. The courtroom doors closed with a soft click behind Matthew, leaving Julia alone with the silence that filled the vast, empty space. She remained seated at her bench, the weight of the moment heavy on her shoulders. Her heart was pounding, her thoughts tangled in a web of emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Matthew's words lingered in the air, echoing in her mind. "I was a coward. I lost the best thing that ever happened to me." She had wanted to hear those words once, to make sense of the abandonment. But now that she had them, they didn't feel like the victory she had imagined. Instead, they felt hollow, like an explanation that came too late, after too much damage had been done. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to compartmentalize the conversation, to lock it away like a painful chapter in an old book. Tomorrow, she would return to the courtroom as Judge Julia Reynolds, the woman who had built her life from the ashes Matthew had left behind. But for today, for just a few more moments, she allowed herself to feel the pain, the anger, and the closure that had eluded her for so long. She stood, gathering her notes, and exited the courtroom, her heels clicking against the marble floors as she walked toward her chambers. The courthouse was quiet, the lunchtime lull leaving the halls nearly deserted. She passed by colleagues who offered her friendly nods, unaware of the storm that had just passed through her life. Julia returned their greetings with a small smile, keeping her composure as always. But once inside her chambers, with the door shut firmly behind her, the mask slipped. Julia sat down heavily at her desk, running a hand through her hair. Her mind raced, replaying the conversation with Matthew over and over. His face, older and more tired than she remembered, flashed before her eyes. The regret, the sadness, the brokenness in his voice when he apologized. He had hurt her, there was no denying that. He had ripped her heart out in the most public and humiliating way possible, and she had spent years rebuilding her life because of it. But seeing him now, so different from the man she had once loved, stirred something unexpected in her, a faint glimmer of sympathy. Not forgiveness, she wasn't ready for that, but sympathy. Matthew hadn't lived the life he'd hoped for. That much was clear. And while it didn't excuse what he had done, it gave her a window into his own struggles he had never been brave enough to confront back then. The boy she had fallen in love with, the one who had promised her forever, had been too afraid of what that commitment meant, and in the end, his fear had cost them both dearly. Julia's phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Katie, her best friend since childhood, and the maid of honor on that infamous day. "Katie, lunch tomorrow. I miss your face." Julia smiled faintly. Katie had been her rock through everything. The heartbreak, the law school years, the rise to becoming a judge. Even after all these years, she never hesitated to remind Julia that life moved forward, even when it felt like it was crumbling. She quickly typed back a response. "Julia, wouldn't miss it. See you at 12. Setting her phone aside, Julia leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, she would have to face Matthew again in court. The thought made her stomach twist. Not because she was afraid of him, but because she wasn't sure how to navigate the complex emotions that had resurfaced. She had spent years building her armor, her professional reputation, her success, her independence. But now, cracks were beginning to show, and it unnerved her. How could she maintain her objectivity when the very man who had shattered her heart was sitting in front of her, pleading for a fair trial? She wasn't sure she could do it, not with everything that had happened between them. But she also knew that if she didn't, it would feel like Matthew had won again, like he still held power over her life. And she wasn't about to let that happen. The next day came too quickly, the morning sun breaking through the clouds as if mocking Julia's inner turmoil. The courthouse was buzzing with activity when she arrived, a sea of faces moving through the halls, unaware of the personal battle raging within their presiding judge. Julia walked through the crowd with purpose, her chin held high, determined to maintain her professionalism. As she stepped into the courtroom, a hush fell over the room. The parties involved in today's cases were already seated, including Matthew and his soon-to-be ex-wife, Alyssa. Julia kept her eyes forward, refusing to meet Matthew's gaze as she took her seat behind the bench. The proceedings resumed without incident. Alyssa's lawyer continued to present her case, citing Matthew's financial mismanagement and emotional neglect as grounds for a significant settlement. Matthew's lawyer countered, arguing that Alyssa had been equally complicit in the breakdown of the marriage, her constant criticism pushing Matthew away. It was a typical divorce case, messy, painful, and full of accusations from both sides. But Julia was distracted. She could feel Matthew's presence in the room, a weight that made it difficult to focus. Every time his lawyer spoke, she felt the tension between them, a silent undercurrent that neither of them could acknowledge. Halfway through the session, Alyssa's lawyer presented a particularly damning piece of evidence, financial records that showed Matthew had drained several joint accounts to fund a failed business venture without Alyssa's knowledge. The room went silent as the documents were handed to Julia for review. Julia's eyes scanned the papers, her heart sinking as she read the details. It was worse than she had thought. Matthew had made a series of reckless decisions, gambling their financial future on a business that had never materialized. Alyssa had every right to be furious. As she looked up from the documents, her gaze landed on Matthew. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists on the table. He didn't need to say anything. His regret was written all over his face. For the first time since the trial began, Julia's resolve faltered. She had expected to feel satisfaction at seeing Matthew brought low, but instead, all she felt was a deep sense of sadness. This wasn't the man she had once known. The Matthew she had loved had been ambitious, full of dreams, but this Matthew was broken. His life had spiraled out of control. And now, sitting in her courtroom, he was paying the price for his mistakes. It was hard to reconcile the two versions of him in her mind, the man who had walked out on her at the altar, and the man who now sat before her, defeated and ashamed. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The lawyers made their closing arguments, the court adjourned, and Julia retreated to her chambers, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. She sat at her desk, staring blankly at the papers in front of her, unsure of how to proceed. She knew what the law demanded. Matthew's actions had been reckless, and Alyssa deserved compensation. But there was a part of Julia, a small, quiet part, that still remembered the boy she had loved, the boy who had once promised her forever. Could she truly separate the man in front of her from the one in her memories? Could she deliver a verdict that was both fair and just, without letting her personal feelings cloud her judgment? Julia exhaled slowly, running a hand over her face. Tomorrow, she would have to make her decision. But tonight, she would allow herself to feel the weight of everything that had come rushing back into her life. As she left the courthouse that evening, the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the city. Julia walked to her car, her thoughts heavy. She had always believed that time healed all wounds, but now she wasn't so sure. Maybe some scars never fully fade. Maybe some ghosts never truly leave. But tomorrow, she would face Matthew again. And this time, she would be ready. The gavel was in her hands now, and for the first time, Julia realized that she had the power to decide how her story would end. And this time, she wouldn't be the one left behind. The verdict of two lives. The next morning dawned cold and gray, a reflection of the unease that had settled in Julia's chest. She hadn't slept well. How could she? The weight of the upcoming decision, combined with the emotional turmoil of seeing Matthew again, made it nearly impossible to find rest. Julia sat at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on the steady rain falling outside her window. She had always found the rain to be soothing, but today it only added to the heaviness in her heart. The case was clear-cut from a legal perspective. Matthew had made a series of reckless financial decisions, and Alyssa was well within her rights to demand a substantial settlement. But it wasn't just about the law anymore. This case had become personal in ways Julia had never expected. She had worked so hard to rebuild her life after Matthew had left her, and now here he was, sitting in front of her in a courtroom, asking for fairness. How was she supposed to remain impartial when every interaction with him stirred up old wounds? How could she deliver a just verdict when her heart was still tangled in the past? But Julia knew that she had no choice. She was a judge, and her job was to uphold the law. Personal feelings couldn't interfere with her duty, no matter how much pain they brought to the surface. With a deep breath, she set her coffee cup down and rose from the table. Today would be difficult, but she would face it head-on, just as she had faced every challenge in her life since Matthew had left her standing at that altar. She had grown stronger since then, and she wasn't about to let him, or the emotions he stirred up, bring her down again. The courthouse buzzed with the usual morning activity when Julia arrived. Lawyers shuffled through papers, clients whispered nervously to one another, and court staff moved with purpose through the halls. Julia greeted her colleagues with a polite nod, though her mind was elsewhere. As she stepped into the courtroom, she was met with the now familiar sight of Matthew and Alyssa seated at their respective tables. Matthew's lawyer, a middle-aged man with a gruff demeanor, was flipping through his notes, while Alyssa's attorney sat poised, ready for the final session of arguments. The tension in the room was palpable. Julia took her seat at the bench, adjusting her robe and scanning the courtroom. She could feel Matthew's eyes on her, but she refused to meet his gaze. Today, more than ever, she needed to maintain her composure. This was not about them. It was about the law. The court clerk stood and called the case. All rise for the Honorable Judge Julia Reynolds. The court is now in session. Julia picked up her gavel and tapped it lightly against the bench, signaling the start of the final proceedings. "You may be seated," she said, her voice steady and controlled. Alyssa's attorney, Ms. Parker, was the first to speak. She approached the bench with a confident stride, her dark hair pulled back into a sleek bun. "Your Honor," she began, her voice firm but respectful, "we have presented a clear and indisputable case. Mr. Stinson's reckless financial behavior has left my client in a vulnerable position. His decision to deplete their joint accounts to fund a failed business venture without consulting Mrs. Stinson has not only jeopardized their financial future, but also demonstrated a complete lack of responsibility. We are requesting a settlement that compensates Mrs. Stinson for the damages incurred." Julia listened carefully, her expression neutral. Ms. Parker was a skilled lawyer, and her arguments were solid. The evidence was damning. Matthew had, indeed, made a series of poor decisions that had cost him and Alyssa dearly. When Ms. Parker finished, she returned to her seat, her eyes flickering briefly toward Matthew with a look of disdain. Next, Matthew's lawyer, Mr. Gates, stood and made his way to the front of the room. He was a seasoned attorney, with a graying beard and the kind of calm, measured demeanor that came from decades of courtroom experience. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Your Honor," he began, his voice low and deliberate, "while we do not dispute the facts presented by the plaintiff's counsel, I would like to remind the court that my client, Mr. Stinson, acted with the best of intentions. Yes, his business venture failed, and yes, it had a significant impact on the couple's finances. But Mr. Stinson did not act out of malice or negligence. He was trying to build something for the future, something that would benefit both him and Mrs. Stinson." Julia shifted in her seat, Her attention focused on Mr. Gates' words. It was a classic defense, intent over outcome. But intentions didn't always absolve someone from the consequences of their actions. Furthermore, Mr. Gates continued, "We would like to highlight that Mrs. Stinson has not been left destitute by this venture. While her lifestyle may have been affected, she retains significant personal assets that are not tied to the joint accounts. My client recognizes his mistakes and is prepared to make amends, but the requested settlement is excessive given the circumstances." With that, Mr. Gates returned to his seat. The room fell into a tense silence, all eyes on Julia as they waited for her response. Julia took a moment, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom. She saw Alyssa, sitting stiffly, her arms crossed in front of her. There was anger in her eyes, anger that Julia understood all too well. And then there was Matthew, sitting beside his lawyer, looking far older than his years. He had the same haunted look he had worn the day before, his eyes cast downward, as if he was trying to avoid the weight of the moment. For a long time, Julia said nothing. She weighed the facts in her mind, sorting through the legal arguments while keeping her emotions in check. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "I have reviewed the evidence and listened to the arguments presented by both parties. It is clear that Mr. Stinson made a series of poor financial decisions that have had a lasting impact on this marriage. While I acknowledge that his intentions may have been well-meaning, the reality is that his actions were reckless and ultimately detrimental to the financial stability of the couple." Julia paused, her gaze shifting to Matthew. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw the flicker of recognition in his expression, the understanding that she, of all people, would not be swayed by sympathy. As a result, she continued, her tone unwavering, "I am awarding Mrs. Stinson a financial settlement that will compensate her for the losses incurred due to Mr. Stinson's actions. This includes a portion of the joint assets as well as spousal support for a period of 3 years. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the decision was announced. Alyssa's face remained impassive, though Julia could see the satisfaction in her eyes. Matthew, on the other hand, seemed to shrink in his seat. His shoulders slumped, and his hands tightened around the edges of the table. The weight of the verdict had clearly settled on him. But Julia wasn't finished. "However," she said, her voice growing softer but still firm, "I also want to acknowledge that divorce is not simply a financial transaction. It is the end of a relationship, and often both parties bear some responsibility for its breakdown. While Mr. Stinson's actions were reckless, this court recognizes that both parties contributed to the dissolution of this marriage in different ways. My ruling is based on the financial damages, but it does not assign blame for the emotional complexities that accompany the end of a relationship." With that, Julia brought down her gavel, signaling the end of the proceedings. Court is adjourned. The courtroom buzzed with activity as people began to gather their belongings and file out. Julia remained seated, watching as Alyssa stood, gave a final look in Matthew's direction, and exited the room without a word. Matthew sat motionless for a few moments, his head bowed, before slowly rising from his seat. He exchanged a few quiet words with his lawyer before turning toward the exit. For a brief moment, Julia thought he might approach her again, say something, anything. But he didn't. Instead, he walked out of the courtroom, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the past, and disappeared into the crowded hallway. Julia sat in silence for a few minutes, letting the weight of the day settle over her. The verdict had been fair, impartial. She had done her job, upheld the law. But the personal cost of delivering that verdict had been greater than she could have anticipated. In that moment, Julia realized something important. Closure wasn't always a clean break. It wasn't something that came neatly packaged in apologies or verdicts. It was messy, complicated, and sometimes left you with more questions than answers. But as she gathered her notes and prepared to leave the courtroom, Julia knew one thing for certain. She had faced the ghosts of her past, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. Tomorrow would be a new day. And though the scars of the past would always be with her, Julia was ready to move forward. She had finally found her own verdict, and this time it wasn't about Matthew. It was about her. As Julia stepped out of the courthouse and into the crisp evening air, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a fresh, clean scent. She walked slowly to her car, feeling the weight of the day lift with each step. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a woman haunted by the past. She felt like a woman ready to embrace her future. The weight of moving on. The sky was an endless stretch of gray as Julia drove home from the courthouse, her hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. The streets of the city blurred past her as she navigated the familiar route, though today everything felt different. The verdict she had delivered in Matthew's divorce case played on a loop in her mind. It had been fair, legally sound, and the right decision for both parties. And yet, the emotional toll lingered, heavier than she had expected. It wasn't just about Matthew. It was about everything that he represented, the broken promises, the heartache she had buried for years, and the closure she thought she'd gained, but had never fully received. Confronting him again had opened old wounds, one she had spent a decade trying to heal. Now that she had faced him, the past no longer seemed like a distant memory, but a shadow that had been waiting to resurface all along. As she pulled into her driveway, Julia sighed, staring at the modest but cozy home she had built for herself. It was a symbol of the life she had painstakingly reconstructed, brick by brick. The rose bushes that lined the walkway bloomed beautifully, despite the recent rain, their petals glistening under the soft, fading light. It was a house filled with warmth and love, but a house she had once imagined sharing with someone who had turned out to be the wrong person. Shaking her head, Julia stepped out of the car, the evening breeze cool against her skin. She paused at the front door, keys in hand, and took a deep breath. It was time to move forward, she told herself. Today had been difficult, but she had survived, and she would continue to survive. Inside, the house greeted her with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in the courtroom. She slipped off her shoes, dropping her purse by the door, and headed straight to the kitchen. Her black cat, Luna, stretched lazily on the counter, her green eyes blinking slowly as she welcomed Julia home. Julia smiled, stroking the cat's soft fur as she filled the kettle with water for tea. "You wouldn't believe the day I've had, Luna," she murmured, watching as the cat purred contentedly. Luna had been with her through it all, the long nights of law school, the early mornings as a young attorney, and now, the challenges of being a judge. She had been a quiet companion, one who never judged or questioned, just offered her silent presence. And right now, Julia was grateful for the stillness. As the kettle began to boil, Julia's phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her back into the moment. It was a text from Katie, her best friend, checking in after hearing about the case. "Katie, how did it go? Are you okay? Do you need wine?" Julia chuckled softly. Katie had always known exactly what she needed. There had been many nights over the years when they had sat together, drinking wine and talking through the heartbreaks, the victories, and everything in between. "Julia, the verdict's done. I'm okay, but wine wouldn't hurt." A few seconds later, Katie's reply came through. "Katie, be there in 30. I'm bringing your favorite." Julia smiled, feeling a little lighter knowing her friend would be there soon. Katie had been her rock for so many years, since childhood, really. She had been there for the mess with Matthew, and through all the ups and downs that had followed. And tonight, it seemed, would be no different. True to her word, Katie arrived half an hour later, a bottle of red wine in hand, and a wide smile on her face. She stepped inside without hesitation, as she always did, and gave Julia a warm hug. "Well, hello, Judge Reynolds," Katie teased lightly. "You look like you've had a day." "You have no idea," Julia replied, rolling her eyes but smiling as she took the wine from Katie. "Let's just say it's been complicated." They settled in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the fireplace as the two of them sat on the couch, glasses of wine in hand. Julia hadn't realized just how much she needed this. Katie's familiar presence, the warmth of the fire, the comfort of home. For the first time all day, she felt like she could breathe again. "So, spill," Katie said, raising an eyebrow as she took a sip of her wine. "How was it, seeing him again?" Julia exhaled, leaning back into the cushions. "It was strange. Harder than I thought it would be. He's different now, Katie. I don't know if it's the years or the regrets, but he's not the same Matthew who left me at the altar." "People change," Katie said softly, her eyes filled with empathy. "But that doesn't mean it erases what he did to you." "No, it doesn't," Julia agreed, swirling the wine in her glass. "He apologized, for everything. And I could see that he meant it. But the truth is, his apology doesn't fix the years I spent picking up the pieces of my life after he walked away. I don't hate him anymore. I don't think I ever really did. But I can't forgive him either. At least not yet." Katie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You don't have to forgive him, Julia. You've built a beautiful life for yourself, and you've done it on your own terms. That's what matters." Julia smiled, her heart warming at her friend's words. "I know, and I'm proud of that. But seeing him, it just stirred up so much. The past, the what-ifs, all of it." Katie reached over and squeezed Julia's hand. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. You've always been. The fact that you handled that case with the professionalism you did, even with everything between you and Matthew, just shows how far you've come." Julia looked down at their hands, feeling a swell of gratitude for the friend who had been by her side through thick and thin. "Thank you, Katie. I don't know what I'd do without you." "Lucky for you, you'll never have to find out," Katie said with a grin, raising her glass in a mock toast. "To moving forward, and to never letting the past dictate our future." Julia clinked her glass against Katie's, smiling as she repeated, "To moving forward." The evening passed in a blur of laughter and conversation, the heaviness of the day slowly melting away as Julia and Katie talked about everything from work to relationships to the latest gossip in their circle of friends. It felt good to laugh, to let go, even if just for a little while. But as the night drew to a close and Katie prepared to leave, Julia found herself once again thinking about Matthew. It wasn't that she missed him, or even that she wished things had turned out differently. But the encounter had left her with a lingering sense of unfinished business. After Katie left, Julia stood by the window, staring out into the night. The rain had stopped, and the streets glistened under the soft glow of the streetlights. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to think about what could have been, not with longing, but with a sense of finality. Matthew had been a part of her past, but that's where he belonged. Their story had ended the day he walked away, and while it had taken her years to fully heal, she knew now that she had. Seeing him again had been difficult, yes, but it had also shown her just how far she had come. She was no longer the heartbroken girl standing at the altar, waiting for someone who would never arrive. She was a woman who had built her own future, who had learned to stand on her own, and who had found peace in the life she had created for herself. With a deep breath, Julia turned away from the window and headed upstairs to her bedroom. Tomorrow would be another day, and with it would come new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. As she climbed into bed, Luna curled up at her feet, purring softly. Julia smiled, closing her eyes and letting the warmth of her home wrap around her like a blanket. She had faced her past, confronted the ghosts that had haunted her for years, and now she was ready to move forward. And in the quiet stillness of the night, Julia realized something important. She didn't need Matthew's apology. She didn't need his regrets or his explanations, because she had already found her own closure. And that was enough. The new beginning. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Julia's bedroom, casting a soft, golden light on the room. She stirred slowly, blinking as she adjusted to the brightness, feeling the warmth of the sunlight on her face. There was something different about this morning. For the first time in years, Julia woke up without the weight of the past dragging her down. The events of the last few days, particularly seeing Matthew again, had been exhausting, but they had also been transformative. As she lay in bed, Julia reflected on everything that had transpired. The trial, Matthew's apology, and the realization that she no longer needed anything from him. She had always thought closure would come from hearing those words, from understanding why he had left her, but now she knew better. Closure hadn't come from his apology. It had come from within herself. She had rebuilt her life, created a career she was proud of, surrounded herself with people who loved her, and most importantly, she had learned to stand on her own. Luna, her ever-faithful cat, stretched beside her and nuzzled her hand. Julia smiled, stroking the cat's soft fur. "Good morning, Luna," she whispered, her voice still groggy with sleep. "It's a new day." And it really did feel like a new day. For years, Julia had lived with the shadow of what had happened, with Matthew hanging over her. Even as she had moved forward, part of her had always wondered what she would say if she ever saw him again, what she would feel if they crossed paths. But now, after everything that had happened, Julia realized that chapter of her life was finally, truly closed. After a few moments of peaceful stillness, Julia threw the covers off and padded downstairs to the kitchen. She opened the window, letting the fresh morning air fill the room, and began preparing breakfast. The quiet hum of her coffee machine was the only sound in the house, but instead of feeling lonely, Julia felt content. She no longer needed to fill the silence with distractions. She was comfortable with herself, with the life she had built. As she sat down with her coffee and toast, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from Katie, who had become her lifeline over the years. "Katie, morning, sunshine. How are you feeling today? Want to grab brunch later?" Julia smiled, feeling a swell of gratitude for her best friend. Katie had been there through all of it, from the heartbreak to the healing. And now, as Julia was finally ready to move on from it all, she quickly typed a response. "Julia, feeling good, peaceful, actually. Brunch sounds perfect. Let's do it." With the promise of brunch on the horizon, Julia felt even lighter. But as she sat there, sipping her coffee, her thoughts inevitably drifted back to the courtroom and to Matthew. Not in the painful, heart-wrenching way they once did, but in a quieter, more reflective way. Matthew had been such a big part of her life at one point. She had loved him deeply, and losing him had nearly broken her. But now, looking back, she realized that what she had experienced wasn't just about losing Matthew. It was about losing the life she had imagined. She had thought they would grow old together, build a family, and share all of life's moments. When he walked away, it wasn't just him she lost. It was that future. But life had a funny way of unfolding in ways you didn't expect. And the future she had built for herself, though different, was one she was deeply proud of. As she cleaned up after breakfast, Julia decided that it was time to embrace that future fully. She had spent so long proving to herself that she could move on from Matthew, that she could thrive without him. But now it was time to truly live, to stop carrying the remnants of that heartbreak with her like a badge of honor. She had survived, yes, but now she wanted to thrive. Later that morning, Julia met Katie at their favorite brunch spot, a quaint little cafe nestled on a quiet street downtown. The cafe was buzzing with the usual weekend crowd, but it was the kind of noise Julia found comforting, a reminder that life was happening all around her. Katie waved from a corner table, already sipping on a mimosa. "There she is," she called, her voice bright and cheerful. "You look radiant, by the way. Something's changed, hasn't it?" Julia smiled as she slid into the chair opposite Katie. "I feel different," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "Seeing Matthew again, it was hard, but it was also necessary. I think I'd finally closed that chapter for good." Katie raised her glass in a mock toast. "To closing chapters and opening new ones," she said with a grin. "I knew you'd get there eventually." As they ordered their food and chatted about work, friends, and life in general, Julia realized just how much she had been holding herself back over the years. She had been so focused on proving that she could move on from Matthew that she hadn't allowed herself to fully embrace the possibilities of her future. But now, sitting here with Katie, laughing and talking about all the things they had planned for the coming weeks, Julia felt ready. Ready to stop looking back and start looking forward. Their conversation eventually drifted back to the courtroom, and Katie leaned in, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "So, what's next for you, Judge Reynolds? Now that the whole Matthew saga is behind you, what are you going to do with all your emotional bandwidth?" Julia laughed, taking a sip of her iced coffee. "Honestly, I think I'm going to focus on me. I've been so caught up in my career, which I love, but there are other things I want to explore. Travel more, maybe take up painting again. I haven't picked up a brush since college." Katie's eyes widened with excitement. "Painting. Yes, I love that. You were so good at it, Julia. Remember that mural you did in our dorm room? It was incredible." Julia smiled at the memory. It had been years since she'd allowed herself to indulge in creative pursuits, always prioritizing her career and responsibilities. But now, the idea of reclaiming that part of herself felt right. It was time to nourish her soul in ways she hadn't before. They lingered over brunch, enjoying the warmth of the cafe and the ease of their friendship. But as the afternoon sun started to dip lower in the sky, Julia found herself thinking about the future, her future. She wasn't the same person she had been when Matthew had left her. She was stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. She had built a life that was full and meaningful, but now it was time to add something more, something that was just for her. That evening, back at home, Julia sat down at her desk with a sketchbook in front of her. It had been years since she'd drawn anything, and the blank page felt both intimidating and exciting. She took a deep breath and picked up a pencil, her hand moving slowly at first, then gaining confidence as the lines began to take shape. It was a simple sketch, a landscape she had once dreamed of visiting. But as the image came to life on the page, Julia felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was her life now. Not defined by the man who had left her, not shaped by the heartbreak she had once carried, but created by her own choices, her own passions. She was no longer looking backward, no longer clinging to the past. As the evening stretched on, Julia continued to draw, letting the rhythm of creativity take over. There was no rush, no deadline, just the joy of doing something she loved, something she had almost forgotten about in the midst of everything else. By the time she finished, the house was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the night outside. Julia set down her pencil and looked at the drawing, a satisfied smile on her face. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was hers, and that was enough. She stood, stretching, and walked over to the window. The sky was clear, the stars twinkling faintly above. As she gazed out into the night, Julia felt a deep sense of contentment. She had faced her past, embraced her present, and was ready for whatever came next. For the first time in years, Julia wasn't waiting for someone else to give her closure. She wasn't looking for answers or apologies. She had found her own peace, her own sense of purpose. And as she stood there, watching the stars, Julia knew that this was just the beginning. Her story was far from over. It was only just beginning.